Okay, welcome back to my podcast on philosophy or whatever it is about all the rest.
Yes.
And today we want to talk about dataism. Do I say
hmm
that right?
Most people say dataism. I tend to say dataism, but that's
That's a Canadian way of saying it, or
no. So I had a student who came up to me and said, "Oh, why are you using the Australian pronunciation of data?" And my response to her was that it used to be data in more of the Anglo-centered world until about, the late 80s, early 90s, when there was a Star Trek character named Data.
data. Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
then you stopped hearing data and you started hearing data more and more. And I remember this because when I was like 7 or 8, I remember using the word data data instead of data, and my mother corrected me. And oh no,
Oh,
one's a kid. And there's an episode
so it's
where
again all about our mothers.
always. Well, no, there was an episode in the series
Are you
where
tracking?
kind of, yeah,
Okay.
closeted Trekkie, right? Um, out homosexual closeted Trekkie.
Okay.
Um,
In real life, you're a homosexual.
no,
In
not in
like
my public life.
closet,
In my public life,
you are tracking.
no, not a Trekkie in my public life. Most of
But
my
in your
friends,
private life and
yeah,
in your
I'll watch.
public life, you're.
Well, I just don't talk about it.
Oh,
Right?
okay.
Yeah. Anyway, um, things that we discuss publicly
You
and we
can
don't.
out yourself. You can come out right now.
Well, no, but like I mean, most of the people in my life, know that I don't date women,
Oh,
right? But not everyone in my life knows that I watch Star Trek,
oh,
right? So
okay,
like
okay.
things that we're more self-conscious about now.
So
But
data sounds more like dating. That's the issue.
um,
Data woman.
yeah, no, I think it's so. If you're watching Star Trek episodes from the original series, they never talk about data, they talk about data.
Oh,
And in most of The Next Generation, they talk about data. And in Deep Space Nine, they talk about data. And a couple of
oh,
characters say data. Um, and so I had the impression that there was this shift in how the word was pronounced because of pop culture. However, there could be regional differences as
yeah.
well that I just was not aware of, like whether people say niche or niche
Oh, yeah,
in
yeah.
English, right? Or
It was probably because there was another person becoming very popular whose name is Friedrich Nietzsche.
uh, at what time are you suggesting,
No, it's
proposing that
the same
Nietzsche
like
became?
with data.
Yeah.
No, but do you know why his name is Data by any chance? Or
The character?
yeah.
Um, it was suggested in the episode that it was a play on the word data,
Oh.
right? So the character, because one of the characters in, I think, earlier in the series called Data, and he corrected her for calling him the wrong name,
Oh.
right? Because she saw the name and assumed that it would be pronounced Data,
So is
right?
okay, what is dataism? Or dataism? You know,
It's
when I say dataism, it sounds more like dadaism.
Dataism,
The
yeah.
no, it sounds like the art form, no?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's realist. Yeah.
Maybe it is.
Well, no, because Dadaism would be different than Dataism,
Hmm.
right? But then depending
But if I
how
say it
if you
American
slur
way,
it.
like,
So I mean, we're not talking about a cult to a
we
Star Trek
talk about
character.
dataism.
No, we're talking about decision making, right? Or
Yeah.
how there's a shift in attitudes to how some decisions should be made.
Mm.
Um, and how we should use, data driven or data driven um, decision making in different parts of our everyday life. Um, and the YouTube video that I think sparked this, us discussing this topic, was a discussion of how complexity is analyzed, or
Mhm.
a series on complexity analytics. And it talked about or described Dataism as an emerging attitude amongst some practitioners within computer science to look at solutions for problems based solely on information or big data that is available to make decisions. Because there are a number of examples where human, quote unquote, intuitive decision making seems quite poor relative to decisions made with big data, right? Where there are thousands or
So
hundreds.
Dataism is about big data.
It's about making decisions and prioritizing how those decisions are made. So one of the examples given in the video was that Dataism prioritizes correlation over causation, right? That causation is indeterminate. We can postulate or speculate what the cause of something might be, but that for decision making, that's less useful to us. It has less utility than to look for correlation, right?
Which is kind of absurd because it's flipping a common paradigm among scientists.
It is. And
normally a scientist is always reminded that just having a correlation does not mean causation.
Exactly.
So he should be very careful, but here they say that's enough, right?
Well, and I think it's an interesting example of how certain areas of science, specifically IT or software engineering, gets influenced more by pressures from business, right? Does it work enough that we can market it? Is this a minimum viable product, rather than how we might think of science coming from a more academic background? Even though that's a bit of an oversimplification, because a lot of research decisions are based on funding, not necessarily, the most purely scientific or academically. I don't want to suggest that there's academic dishonesty in natural sciences, but that sometimes there can be pressure to make pragmatic choices.
So how did you find out about Dataism? When did you encounter it?
Indirectly, when I was doing the secondary research for my master's thesis, I came upon a book called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows, and I was trying to narrow the scope of what I was looking at, but not doing that very well. And the book was fascinating. It was meant to be approachable by the wider public. And she was doing work in systems theory that was also expounded upon by Jay Forrester, who used it for a lot of economics modeling, but also as a way to model ecosystems or different natural phenomena. And the premise behind systems thinking or thinking in systems.
So are you in agreement with Dataism, or are you critical of it?
I think that's too simple a binary. And I haven't gone to... So in looking at systems thinking, Dataism was discussed as a reductionist approach to looking at parts of the universe. And some systems theorists in the video that we'd watched together suggested that there needs to be both in turn, right? Just as, there are certain places where you might want to apply Kantian ethics in your life, and other places where you might want to look at utilitarian ethics, or not, ever. A similar approach could be taken to Dataism or more holistic
as
approaches.
Being a very pragmatic discipline, right?
Yeah.
So if you are interested in Dataism, there's this video, I have to go to the site, that you sent to me on Dataism. It's from System Innovations. Do you remember, like you told me there are many of these videos. Let me just adjust that a little bit so everyone can see it.
That particular video is one of 20-something in a series on complexity analytics that looks at different ways that we use computer systems to simplify complexity. another resource just on big data or complexity analytics had described what we're able to do now with large amounts of information and machine learning or different types of computer-driven analytics is comparable for science and research and the social sciences to some degree as well to the discovery or the refinement of the telescope and the microscope, where those were tools that extended what we were able to apprehend or understand naturally. And that machine learning and big data allows us to identify patterns in large amounts of information that would be beyond our capacity to do so naturally. So I think as social animals, we're able to form connections with about 150 people on average.
And that's how our brain is wired, and that's also how we process most of our information?
Yeah, well, not necessarily how we process most of our information, but that there are different limits to how much information we're used to processing based on how we evolved. Right?
Just Dataism is theoretically unlimited.
Well, no, it's not. So Dataism is more of an approach rather than a specific process or method or tool, I should say, right? I mean, you could think of machine learning or big data as being tools supported by this ideology that in order to get an actionable answer or choice or end product, that we would just look at the data rather than ideas about human intuition or ethics or other things that we might have used as part of our decision-making before. So when I said that computer science as a discipline at times seems influenced by business pressures, that idea of coming to a decision that's most actionable rather than looking for what a root cause is or just exploring all of the possible alternatives. I think like those had, it's not accidental that those had sort of developed in parallel. So in terms of your question, do I think Dataism is better than trying to look for an underlying cause? I think it depends on what type of question you're asking.
Yes. Yeah, I understand you. So you have a very, let's say, careful approach to it.
Well, I think one of the risks of Dataism is that people who see value in it might look at that kind of absolutely. Like I can think of a couple of engineers who I've talked to. Not that it's because they're engineers, but
probably it is. Correlation does not equate causation.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But talking to a couple of people about privacy, who, as a professional, their professional background was in engineering, and they said, "Oh, privacy's dead, right? We shouldn't even talk about privacy." And in a pragmatic sense, yes, all of your information that's accessible online could be hacked if someone was so motivated. Not everyone keeps a Band-Aid over their phone camera.
Yeah.
Right?
What about public bathrooms?
Depends. Do you have your smartphone?
They probably can analyze what I've eaten.
With the camera out. Well, I mean,
it's just like that the Wi-Fi information or the internet use. And they say that time he was on the bathroom.
Because he ate at that restaurant and there's a receipt from that. Sorry, I didn't catch that. First,
and the next day you go and the restaurant is closed.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, so when you first said that, do they know what I ate? I'm just thinking about how at home in Canada there's testing of wastewater for COVID to try to determine what the actual rate of infection is in the population, because most people will go in and get tested or have been when there have been enough tests, but then there are other complicating factors like, aversion to testing or virus denialism or, whatever else.
They started the same project in Germany.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, probably quite a few places, I would imagine. So with the engineer saying privacy is dead, in a pragmatic sense, we have far less privacy than we did 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years. I was watching The Bourne Identity recently, just randomly, and I thought how the entire premise of that movie was based on a world with far less surveillance. And of course, we accept that surveillance. We carry around trackers with us in the form of our phones because it's convenient. There's that exchange that Foucault talked about in Discipline and Punish, where we...
How do you feel about it?
About that giving up of certain freedoms for others? Uneasy, but at the same time, it's a conscious choice that we make, right? Like the phone, by carrying a smartphone with me, it enables me to communicate with people around me, especially where there's a language barrier. It simplifies payments. You'd mentioned earlier, what do people read, right? And now we have our phones. So there are many, many things that we engage with, and sometimes in unhealthy or addictive ways. And that's offset by the question of what privacy are we giving up. I don't use certain apps that require location services, but using a Wi-Fi signal, my phone can still be triangulated, right? So like when we're talking about me coming here to film this, and I said, oh, well, I'll take the bus, right? That's because even though a ride app would be much easier, and I do use ride apps in some countries, I don't want to use one.
Oh, really?
Here, yeah. Just because it requires location services.
Oh, okay.
So even though it's inconvenient.
So you're concerned about your private information?
Well, I think using or choosing not to use the right app, it's kind of a moot point because, as I said, like my location can be triangulated.
So, but why do you do that? Why are you worried that somebody gathers information about your location?
I have had people, I don't want to say stalk, but try to access my location when that wasn't something I wanted to share with them.
Oh, okay.
But I think even before that happening, and that was with, a couple of apps where that was the case, I had put off downloading those apps for some time, those networking or social media apps for that reason. Right? Like I've never had Facebook. Right? I have Instagram very reluctantly, and I had it very late, and I have all of 10 followers because I don't give it out to a lot of my friends. But
you don't have photos on Instagram?
Oh, I do.
Oh, you have.
And it's
for your 10 followers.
My 10 followers.
You do everything for your 10 followers. Like me, if you subscribed. Okay,
well, sorry. No. Like Instagram, I think, was a compromise because I realized that I had gone on dates with a couple of people because they had linked their Instagram, and that was another layer in being able to vet whether or not I wanted to spend.
It was a dating device.
Well,
No, wait, you had Instagram?
No, so I have Instagram. I set it up about 3 years ago. And I set it up because someone who I had gone on a date with, I had met because looking at his Instagram, I realized that we had similar interests, that there were different things that we could talk about. Whereas if someone had just posted selfies in the bathroom on their Instagram, I would question how much we could discuss. Whereas with this person, he had photos of a couple of places, a couple of cities I wanted to visit that I never had. So it was also a way to begin the conversation. So with the Instagram posts I have, obviously it's quite curated, but it's curated so that someone who's asking themselves if they want to meet me for coffee or go to dinner or whatever else can look at it and say, oh, I definitely would be interested, or I definitely wouldn't be interested in talking to this person. So it's again, privacy that I'm giving up very deliberately, so that other choices can be made more efficiently, which comes back to Dataism and the idea that choices should be made as efficiently as possible at all times. Just to finish the thought with the engineer who said privacy is dead, or engineers, practically in some respects, yes, but personally in other respects, no, right? Because there's still
control.
Well, no, I mean, legally there's control, but like a mutual friend of ours was saying, oh, if you have someone's phone number, you can pay X amount of money and you can access their browser history. You can access their chat logs. You can access photos that they've taken.
For real?
Yeah.
You can do that?
Yeah.
Just with having their phone number?
Yes. Here.
And with the help of Dataism, or?
Well, hackers. So it's not Dataism. And this is sort of a side topic from Dataism, and that's illegal
Are
here.
you sure that's possible?
Yes.
But then
it's
they
illegal.
could also.
It's illegal.
Then they could also access my WeChat and my payments, or not?
Yeah. They might not be able to. They might not be able to use that to pay for something, but
because of two-factor identification.
Yeah, but they could use it to find out what you've spent money on, right? What you've bought, what you've purchased.
Let me just cancel my orders on Taobao, my private orders.
Well, but the point is that's illegal. It's not that.
Yeah.
So societally, we have inhibitions against that, right? Yeah. And if I went up to someone,
we haven't progressed yet to the level where everybody is completely public, right?
Well, and that's one of the reasons I don't have Facebook, because very early on, Zuckerberg made statements to the effect that he wanted everything to be available everywhere, and to get rid of that idea that we have.
So he's a hardcore dataist. I define it in a very big, do you know why?
Broad way, very broad way.
I have to say why I define it that way.
Okay, so no, do tell.
Let's go back to the video that we just started. This is the video. You see that now on YouTube. We also have that as a podcast. If you're interested in the video, I put that link into the podcast description too. And it tells the story of how Dataism started. And it basically mentions one article in the Wire, or the Wired magazine. How's it called? Wired, yeah. And it is the article is called "The End of Theory. The Data Deluge Makes the Scientific Method Obsolete." I forgot to write down the name of the author. Chris Anderson. Chris Anderson. And this article, I mean, it already starts with the title, "The End of Theory." The End of Theory. Let me shift that here a little bit better for the viewers, so they can see the complete information. So, and we can go through some quotes of that in a minute. And that's why I have this strict idea, because basically it says that Dataism wants to tell us, like, we don't need theories anymore.
Right. Except, so the issue with that, and again, the discussion, the acquaintance, I shouldn't just say the engineer, but I
don't even know.
No, but
just like,
I don't want to like limit someone based on their profession, even though
I'm just, how would we call that kind of ism?
Well,
professionalism?
No, but
racism, what is that? It's a kind of racism.
Discrimination? No, I mean, I think it's a stereotyping rather than discrimination, because it's
stereotypism. I'm sorry, okay, I'm interrupting.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm glad you're enjoying this. I'm taking myself too seriously. But like, it might be okay for me to message someone on a dating app and say, oh, I saw on your Instagram that you visited the city. I really want to go, tell me about it, right? Like, that's how my last serious relationship started. It would be another thing entirely if because of social conventions, you started by saying, oh, well, we have all of these things in common because I found out your name and I Googled this
and I paid these services. I looked at your browser history.
We have the same king. No, or whatever else, right? And if it's information that an individual hasn't put forward, in an obviously consensual way, then a lot of people have an aversion to that. It's like, our previous discussion about how we negotiate privacy, with the toilet, right? And in public spaces. And so even though there's this idea that privacy is dead, or that dataism, is the one true way to find all of our answers, there's a bit of a risk with absolutism there, because it ignores that the way that you frame the question is going to determine the answer that you get.
Yes.
Right? So one of the limitations with dataism, it's like Borges's map, right? The world we live in is much more complicated than whatever very neat, limited algorithm we might write when we're looking at code.
But see, the interesting thing is that Chris Anderson, the inventor of Dataism, in that article, he says we don't need questions anymore. He says
That's incredibly
need data.
limiting. That's incredibly limiting, because there are lots of questions about personal growth or personal development that are just that. They're personal. Like when you talked about there being certain spaces where you could contemplate an idea, using dataism, you could probably come to a statistically derived conclusion about what it is that you're pondering. But I think that negates a certain part of the human experience, right? So, there are questions that historically we considered unanswerable, right? Like they were, for whatever reason, outside of that which we could know. And dataism, or data-driven, solutions, or, inquiry, maybe that's a good way to put it, data-driven inquiry is a good way to gather deeper insights into things that were previously impossible, right? Or, using
like a new form of microscope or telescope, as you have said.
Yeah, or, using software, for example, AlphaGo, to solve problems beyond what people could, or what we naturally could, right? So like the example that the human player who lost the first historic Go match.
Lee Sedol?
Yes, thank you. Lee Sedol, that after he began practicing with AlphaGo, one of the commenters in the documentary said, we're now seeing what an 11 Dan match would look like, when previously the scale only went to 9.
Yeah.
Right now, we're changing the scale for individuals at the very far extremes of human capacity. Or how...
That's the same what Magnus Carlsen, the world champion in chess, said when he watched Alpha Zero playing against the strongest machine, Stockfish. He said when he saw that game, he had the impression that this was like aliens coming to Earth playing chess, like something completely unimaginable in the realm of chess.
It was beyond the scope that we had. And so I think data-driven inquiry is really, really valuable for some things, proteomics, for example. So genomics looks at how different genes are sequenced. Proteomics is the study of how different genes might get a protein to fold, or how a protein, a string of amino acids, is going to fold in a particular way to create a useful protein as opposed to something carcinogenic. So that's something incredibly complicated that a human isn't going to be able to intuitively grasp with, our limits of 150 people and, our awareness of three-dimensional space, or four-dimensional, depending on how you look at that. So there are questions we previously couldn't answer. It's expanding that limit, that, aliens playing chess, what was previously unthinkable. But I think it's a mistake to assume that that creates the answer to everything.
Yes.
Right? Because I think we talked about Levinas and totality and infinity, and I think this data-driven inquiry, it pushes further, what the totality of human knowledge is, right? So we have things that we previously thought were part of the infinite, but I don't think that that ameliorates or gets rid of the fact that there are, certain infinities out there, right, that we may not be able to
That will
measure.
still pose an existential problem for us.
Yeah. So, I mean,
because you mentioned Levinas, that's
whether that's a question of death or consciousness or God.
and I have a good example. So I'm pretty sure when we use Dataism, the absolute Dataism, that Dataism could tell me who's the perfect match, the perfect date for me, or the perfect match of the woman that I could marry and have kids with. And I think it doesn't matter. Do you know why?
Why?
Because she wouldn't date me anyway.
You don't know that. Well, and
no, I know that. I know that. And this existential
dread.
It's in me.
So one of my first serious relationships, we both had different bodily insecurities, right, about how we looked and how we appeared. And we looked quite different, but we both found each other attractive, right? So this person was my physical ideal and I was his. And there was a moment of sort of shock when we'd be talking about other people at a bar or a club. And I realized very quickly, body types that I was averse to, because guys who look like me, he found attractive. Even though I knew that personally, I wasn't extending that up. So I think you just need to find a woman who, or a spouse. I shouldn't say a woman, but a person, a spouse, a woman. Yeah. I mean, obviously you're straight, and I'm not implying otherwise, but I feel like saying a woman objectifies.
Okay.
So to find someone where your foibles are something they find endearing, right? Because I think we can find people who love us at our worst, right? I mean, that doesn't mean we'll necessarily love them back. But when you talked about big data being used to find the perfect someone, or the person who's most compatible, right? The puzzle piece that fits, closest. That's interesting, but I worry that in some ways, as much information as you might gather, that still ends up being a little bit superficial, right? Because people grow and people change, and even if you are...
that's also an interesting thing when we come to our discussion of foundation, right? Because the idea in the series Foundation is that we have, how's it called? Psychohistory?
Psychohistory, yeah.
Shouldn't it involve any mathematical term? That's what I thought.
Well...
Because it's the idea that you can determine history by virtue of mathematics. Right?
Yeah. Or that there's a formula that would allow you to extrapolate, how a civilization would develop.
Yes.
Are we going to start talking about?
Not yet entirely, but it's a kind of data as theory. Right?
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, why the show adapts so well now from a 1950s, 1940s, whenever...
Yeah, 1940s. Yeah.
Okay, whenever it was...
He wrote that during World War II.
Yeah.
Asimov, by the way.
I think if someone had tried to do a TV show about that 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, it would have been that idea of a program to explain all things. It might have seemed a little too far-fetched, a little too magical, rather than scientific.
It seemed to me at the first instance where I watched it, I was...
it's more fantasy than science fiction. I was going to say this when we were talking about Foundation, but I think part of the reason that it got attention to be produced right now is because for the last, 5-10 years, the idea of Dataism with certain scientific disciplines has been gaining enough traction that it doesn't seem far-fetched, that it seems more plausible, because there are lots of examples where solutions to problems have been identified based on data sets using hundreds of thousands, right, or millions of points that we didn't have the computing capacity for, and that the human mind can't make an intuitive judgment about. We just see static.
Or, like I just watched the first episode, right? And I see it in a sense, or the dataist in that show, right? Who has like the psychohistory and who claims that he can determine the mathematician, right? Who claims that he can determine the outcome of a specific form of history. I looked at him as like, okay, that is interesting. He's like an absolute dataist who claims this is what will happen according to my theory. But at the same time, it's not presented to be true in the show because you have a second character who's supposed to understand but he technically cannot prove anything, right? He can just prove it to people who understand him.
And there's only one other person.
Yeah, and the other person says somehow he's right. And we're like, okay, great. So you can still be critical of that theory in the show. There's space for being critical.
Oh, absolutely. And that happens, spoilers, throughout the show, where there's questions about whether or not this person is doing something valid or whether he's a charlatan.
Yes.
And later in the show, some of the conclusions are brought to a number of statisticians, and they just said, oh, well, it's really obtuse. We can't make anything of it. And I think in some ways part of the appeal of data-driven solutions, because I think when we talk about Dataism or Dataism, the term thinking about surrealist art that could be painted by 5-year-olds.
I say Dataism, I'm sorry.
No, but everyone says Dataism, right? I think one of the few people I know who says Dataism. When we say that, I think because of the systems innovation article or YouTube clip that we watched, we're thinking about it as something inherently negative or absolutist, right? When there are more shades of gray, right? Like, and that's why I keep saying data-driven solutions, because I think there are lots of spaces where this is again why I suggested the clip. I think it's really, really fascinating, but I don't think it should be taken as an absolute tool, right? I mean, there's a limit to everything.
Well, I see your point on that, right? Let's look now into the article, just that we have a bit of a base here that we discuss, kind of article base. So just to say, the article starts with a presentation of what was assumed before, and then it goes into developing the theory. It looks at history technically, and it says now we are at this point in history. And it starts with the sentence that it doesn't, like, I don't want to let you run into a knife here, right? So this is not the theory that he claims, but maybe you have some ideas. So like the original idea was from George Box, a statistician, like all models are wrong, but some are useful.
No, I'm smiling just because of statisticians who I know. And no, it's amusing because there's some truth to that, right? Like thinking about how large a map has to be in order to encompass all of the details of a thing. There are limits to all of our models, right? And so the question of utility, yes, it becomes important, and it can help drive us to make some better choices. And in a vacuum, a given choice might seem like the best, or it may be the best. But I think it becomes important to ask what the limit to that is.
I understand where you're coming from, right? So this position, however, it evolves, and it evolves to a point where I've forgotten his name. Chris Anderson says we don't need models anymore. So the idea of models is a theory of an older scientific theory, like how we do sciences. So we have now the Google research director Peter Norvig, saying all models are wrong, and increasingly you can succeed without them. So we have here a shift already, but we see, he says, you can succeed without models.
Right. And I feel like that's a very business-driven attitude, because I think, like when we were talking about the scientific method and that being flipped to some extent, if the priority is always on success, right, however that's being measured, it suggests, at least to me, I'll admit I haven't read the article, right? We discussed it a bit, but I haven't read it, that you get to a point where you're giving up your own agency to the tool that you're using to give you the success.
Yeah.
So what happens when the tool breaks, right? Or what happens when, after you've given up your agency, the tool possibly becomes complex enough to have its own agency? Or even if the tool never has agency, we talked about how the question you ask will determine the answer you get. One of the issues that data-driven decisions has created with court decisions in the States and sometimes with hiring decisions is it can sometimes reinforce different structural prejudices. So with certain populations, because of systemic inequality for whatever reason, or whatever type of systemic inequality, some individuals in a population may look as though they're more successful for a job. I had a friend in university, and she was older, and she had studied engineering, I think in the 80s, the 70s or the 80s. And she said that at the time, the engineering building at her then university, I was studying there at the time, they only had women's washrooms every second floor. Right? So for her and the two other women in her class, most of the classes were
and
about 30 to
man
50
washrooms on every floor.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's the perception that women weren't good at math, right, at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And so that drove a decision about how accessible, that space would be for both genders. And as a result, that pushed more women out. So it reinforced that. So if you're trying to make a data-driven decision about hiring or about likelihood of
it's based on a
recurrence
certain
of crime,
normative model that we already have, right? And
it could be, there's that risk, right? So you have to be really careful about what questions you're asking. And even when you are being careful about that, you have to appreciate that there are going to be limits because of complexity with those problems. And so to reduce everything to succeeding without models, in some narrow situations, I have no doubt that's true.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
But
no doubt.
it's a good reflection on the ethical limits and also on thinking about how our societies change. But I want to introduce another limit, because you say, okay, this is like you have no doubt that they will be successful, right?
In some areas.
In some areas, right? So
Proteomics,
there's the next limit.
Great. Yeah. Well, and then the question is, what is the question, right? Like how is it that we're defining success? When you mentioned using all of the collected data about us through some algorithm to find a better partner, Noval Harari had mentioned in Homo Deus.
Harari, not Harari.
Is it Harari?
I don't know. I just, because you say Dataism, it must be Harari,
no, exactly,
right?
Quite possibly, right?
Like Dataism can tell us. Sorry, Dataism can tell us.
YouTube. He's been introduced on several lectures. I could just watch one and remember.
Probably he's just like cooking inside because everyone introduces him wrong.
Maybe one of those, unknowns, right? Unknown. He'd mentioned the possibility of like dating based on algorithmic suggestions, and there are lots of dating websites that do that. And I think the issue I have with that is that, as mentioned in the article, all models are incomplete. And if we're assuming that
all models or all data?
Both, right? Like it's because you make a model based on the data, but the data is incomplete, so the model's incomplete, right? That there's no such thing as an absolute understanding of something. So as soon as you say the models, all models are wrong and you can succeed without them, okay, right? And then you can probably meet someone that you're fairly compatible with through a dating app. But by having the default choice be to give up our agency to a particular system, right? There are certain situations where that's not a bad thing, right? If thinking about commuting to work at home, like years ago, when I did that, if there were self-driving cars everywhere all the time and I didn't have to buy a car, I could just hail a car and with an app and go where I need to go and spend that time reading or working out or socializing, I'd be okay with that. I'd still miss driving a bit, and maybe there'd be space for that, in certain places.
Racing tracks, Mario Kart.
Like shooting ranges at home, right? Like I mean, right? Not everyone has the space, but they might still want to do that for sport, so there's a space for it. But if we're so, I mean, that's a space where I think dataism and data-driven choices or activities or giving up agency to choices being made by big data, I think that's
reasonable.
I think that's good, right? Like I think there's a gain for that, right? For most people and individually, right? But if you're talking about something like dating, to some degree, maybe you do want help with that. But I don't think we should be giving up all of our agency with that. And part of the reason I say that, like I'd mentioned, outing myself as both a Trekkie and, and a homosexual earlier. When I was younger, the number of books that were available in my parents' house, there was a limit to that, right? And yes, my parents read quite a bit and there were quite a few books, but there was very little awareness or discussion of individuals that were non-sexually conforming. And in school, there was very little discussion of that in history, right? So there was a lot of erasure, right? Like Alexander the Great was only portrayed as having a wife and that was it. There's no other discussion, about that. Or, Frederick the Great, right? Like there is no discussion about any...
there's an interesting anecdote from my school time that I'm sorry, you just reminded me of that immediately. And Germany is kind of open towards homosexuality, but that's maybe only recently,
Yeah. And it's changed over its history, right? Because Berlin in the 20s, it was sort of a mecca for that, right? And like Christopher Isherwood went to Berlin because it was less sexually repressed than, Protestant Anglo, not that Germany's not mostly Protestant, but different interpretations of that. So there are things that will shift with our culture throughout time and different values, cultures, I should say, right? Because we're not living in a monoculture, thankfully. I could add to that. But so when it comes to personal agency, I am very skeptical about the idea of making any sort of default decision about that. Like, I think that should be deliberate and measured rather than, and why I don't have Facebook.
Well, and
I mean, one of many reasons why I don't have Facebook, but that sort of...
And what you mentioned, I just want to finish that one story. What you mentioned is also related to the question whether a mere data approach, big data approach, is potentially racist or heteronormative, something like that.
Well, that it could reinforce, as I said, like the answer you get is going to be dependent on how you ask the question. So if you're talking about, like, again, that one line that we keep getting back to, increasingly you can succeed without models, how are we defining success? How are we measuring success? And is that something we should apply to everyone everywhere? Like, part of the reason I'm living and working here is because there's a very different work-life balance than I found at home. And a lot of people I've talked to have said the same thing, in that there are certain freedoms that we give up by living here, and then there are certain freedoms we're afforded in terms of personally economic agency or financial agency, and agency with respect to time. Right? Like a week ago we were at dinner with friends and complaining about going back to work, at the end of an 8-week break, right? And the thought of 2 weeks of paid vacation, that was impressive when I had my first job at home that gave me paid vacation.
In Canada?
Yeah.
For 2 weeks?
Yeah.
You don't have more?
No.
Like in Germany, I think we have 25 days by law.
No.
That's 5 weeks already. Plus the holidays.
Yeah. So there's statutory holidays,
Yeah.
but we just get paid more for if we weren't salaried. If we were salaried, different. So
I thought Canada is more advanced, to be honest, but
in some areas, yes, in others, no.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's, if you're talking about, you know, social services in comparison to the States, generally yes, but then they don't set a high bar. So in terms of like the choices that we make and the freedoms that we have, yes, Dataism might be a really wonderful tool, but how we measure success.
Yes. And there's, by the way, so this is one limit. And there's also the other limit. I thought about it today. Like if you had like this big data approach, couldn't you really make money at the stock market?
Lots of people are trying.
Yeah, and some people may be successful, but see, what that does not take into account is that Dataism, if we apply it like that, is about the past.
Yeah.
Data is always from the past. And people at the stock market, they are not stupid. So it's a game, it's in game theory, it's
people
a game.
That anticipate the choices of others,
Yes, where people adjust.
Yeah. So again, thinking of the dating app, I feel like by giving up agency, that's inherently limiting. But then when you mention that data is based on data of the past, that's also an inherent limit because, again, if we're talking about, you know, awareness or preference, we're looking at data of the past, right? Whereas people, that doesn't assume inherently that people are going to grow, right? Or it assumes that people are going to grow in the same way. Interviews for certain professional positions at home will ask questions that are based on past behavior because they assume that past behavior will repeat. And
because history teaches us nothing.
Well,
we need some platitudes to live, right?
Well, and there
platitudes we live by. Famous book.
Yeah.
Also called Metaphors We Live By.
Oh, okay.
George Lecoq. I think he's Canadian, right? George Lecoq?
I'm not sure. He's new to me.
He's a very important linguist.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But let me look that up.
Yeah.
Or no, maybe.
No. But yeah, like at home with the decisions about hiring, there's statistical justification for that, but you can justify anything with statistics, right? So, I mean, well, we should, I think, use data-driven approaches with certain things like epidemiology. Like, I think that's really important. That's incredibly important. But then with more personal or subjective choices, I think about my salary now, and in a sense, that's a huge, huge failure and loss compared to the work that I had before in Canada. However, there's a different cost of living here. I have more time. I feel I have more agency. That feels like a successful space to me, even though it will be a loss to others, right? I have more income that I can save on a monthly basis in absolute terms here.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because the cost of living was so high relative to what I was getting paid.
Oh, okay.
And it was an entry-level job. But the point is that idea of success, it's relative, right? And it can be deceiving.
Yeah.
Right? Like what measure are you using?
For me, it's the time that I gain here
Yeah,
that I can, because all...
And how do you value that, right?
Yeah.
How do you put, you know, I mean, at home, X amount of dollars per hour, even for salaried positions, they'll give that breakdown. But, you know, that...
By the way, do you know why we all try to save time?
Why?
So that we can procrastinate more.
For some things. For some, no.
It's true. It's true. Think about
it.
But let's. I just want to go through like some like terms here, and then we can finish. So okay, what I found quite interesting is that 60 years ago, digital computers made information readable, 20 years ago, the internet made it reachable, and 10 years ago, the first search engine crawlers made it a single database.
Mm-hmm.
So now we are at the part in history where we are at the most measured age,
Mm-hmm.
and we enter now the so-called petabyte age, and that is the time where I wonder, can I find the quote? Like, yeah, I think so. It's not just making it a single database anymore, but where we basically utilize this database so that we have no theory in the end anymore. It's just data.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's the idea. You can comment on that. But
And I worry that that's still possibly too simplistic.
it is, yeah.
Right. I mean, definitely something worth pursuing, but something worth pursuing without assuming that there's an endpoint. Right? Like talking about memes. There was some meme about, 4 squares and one person saying, oh,
yeah, I know.
That's the neat thing about it. You never get to the end. You never get to mastery of it. And so one talking about philosophy, another talking about bodybuilding, and it was the same format. It was someone who was new to a field learning more and asking someone older when they mastered it or when they, had learned everything there was to learn or gotten to a point where an end point or a stopping point with it. And the person with more experience says that's the nice thing about it or the horrible thing, right? You never get there. So I think that idea of petabyte age or, getting past all models, I think it's worthy to aspire to that, but to assume that that's the end of anything, right? Making that assumption limits us. It's going to limit what choices we will make, right? The grammatically incorrect, a more perfect union, right? In the American Constitution, it assumes that perfection isn't. It's not possible. But that it's something we can strive towards, even with the reality of failing or the potential to fail. And I feel as I'm saying that I am taking that article out of context, possibly because I don't know how it ends, and it's quite possible that there's that suggestion in a very nuanced way at the end, but I'm not sure.
No.
Oh, there isn't. Okay.
This is the extreme version. That was the initial article.
Okay.
Maybe he wrote it in a very aggressive way, I would say, or maybe one-sided way, so that it would be...
Well, but people take comfort in absolute answers.
Yes.
Right? That's one of the reasons that people engage with religion in different degrees, but there's some people who find a lot of comfort in that because there's certainty in an uncertain world. And I think Dataism is very similar in some respects. And Harari alluded to that when he talked about certain technocentric ideologies that could emerge, right? And he was comparing those to faith or, political ideologies, that those offer digestible answers to things that ultimately can't be answered completely. So yeah, as an extreme version, I'm not surprised that it exists, but I think like there's a space where we can be curious and ask questions and use these tools and make these tools better. But I think as a society, we don't want to have everyone going so far, becoming so dependent on that we stop asking other questions.
Yes. And that just brings me to my final words. As a philosopher, I always think we need to train ourselves in dialectical thinking. And in the end, it is about discovering that we are, as human beings, an open question. What do you think about Dataism? Let us know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. You can find the podcast on that. It will be more easily watchable because here I will just post small snippets on YouTube. You find the whole episode on the podcast. If you listen to the podcast, then you can also watch real human beings talking about data. Yeah. We are compressed data in an organic form, exposed to the dilemma of life. That may be more interesting. So again, thanks for watching. Did I forget anything?
No, that was brilliant.
Okay, then thank you very much, and see you next time.